I'm going to introduce Martin Hilpert. So Martin is a professor of English linguistics at the University of Neuchâtel, Switzerland, with a postdoctoral research at the International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley, and at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies. His main research areas are cognitive linguistics, language change, construction grammar, and corpus linguistics. The results of his research work has been published in so many different papers and volumes that it would take me the whole hour to list them all. So I won't. So please welcome Martin Hilpert.
Yeah, thanks, Thiago, for the invitation and this nice introduction. And also, this is the last talk, so I think it's in order if we give Thiago and all his helpers a really, really big hand for a fantastic conference. Everything has been so well organized, and your hospitality has been fantastic, and you've fed us unhealthy but delicious snacks. Really, it's been a fantastic experience. So I guess I'm saying that a wonderful conference is slowly winding down and coming to its end. You've all given your talks, so you're off the hook. Yeah, you can relax, and yeah, I'd actually like you to lean back and enjoy this. And I'd like to invite you to maybe take a step back from all the new insights that you have gained over the past days, and to take this moment as a kind of opportunity for some general reflections, yeah? So some thinking. And in this case, I would like to talk about some general reflections on diachronic construction grammar. Okay, so what is diachronic construction grammar? The way I think of it is that it's the study of changes in the constructional network. Yeah, so knowledge of language in a constructional perspective is a big network, and of course there are things that happen in that network, and that is what diachronic construction grammar is all about. And as you can see on the slide, diachronic construction grammar has emerged as a very active field of research. Yeah, there's a lot happening. There's not only a growing body of books and articles that are situated in this field, addressing theoretical and empirical phenomena in many different languages. So there's much more than I could fit on this slide. Also at this conference, there have been many talks on constructionalization and constructional change. And of course, there are many interesting dissertations on these topics that are currently in preparation. So to me, it's very obvious that diachronic construction grammar is an idea whose time has come, really. And I see all of this with excitement and enthusiasm, but I think it's also worthwhile to stop for a minute and reflect, to view the project of diachronic construction grammar in its broader context. Yeah? What are the basic assumptions? What is it that we ultimately want to achieve? And how does all of this fit into the context of other constructional approaches to language? This conference very nicely illustrated that construction grammar is actually a broad enterprise, a broad church thing that has many different side projects, and all of this has to fit together in some way. All right. So to me, the answers to these questions are less than obvious, and there are some issues that honestly I find actually a bit puzzling. For instance, you could point out that construction grammar and diachronic linguistics are somewhat strange bedfellows to begin with. Yeah? Construction grammar is a mentalistic approach to language that focuses on the question how language is represented in the minds, in the knowledge of speakers. Yeah? Its main goal is actually inherited from Chomsky and generative linguistics to describe as accurately as possible the cognitive system that allows a human being to acquire and use knowledge. What is it that speakers know when they know a language? Diachronic linguistics, on the other hand, is the study of how forms and meanings of a language change over time. And there are a number of important differences in the respective outlooks of these projects, yeah? Including the fact that construction grammar tries to model linguistic knowledge in the individual, whereas diachronic linguistics typically has the population as its main level of description. construction grammar is a cognitive enterprise that tries to find out how language is represented in the mind, which is not necessarily the case in diachronic linguistics, which may content itself with statement about what's found in the physical record. Yeah? What is in the corpora, what is there that we can describe. And diachronic linguistics may stop there with language being described as it is passed down from one generation to another and as it is preserved in historical documents. A third difference, construction grammar focuses on processes that happen on what could be called a human timescale. So things like language acquisition takes a few years, but we eventually get there. Forming schemas, something that might happen in an instant like this. Making generalizations or planning utterances, so things that even are in the milliseconds, fast processes. By contrast, the processes that diachronic linguistics address, grammaticalization, sound change, lexical semantic change, things like that, those are processes that happen during much longer time intervals. So the time scales of construction grammar as originally conceived and diachronic linguistics are very, very different. So I'm not saying that construction grammar and diachronic linguistics are contradicting each other or not compatible with one another, but contrasts like these make it actually quite surprising that the combination of the two enjoys such popularity. Yeah, so it's nothing that I can really explain, it just is the way it is. So in this talk, I would like to raise 3 questions that might help us understand a bit more thoroughly how exactly the two, construction grammar and diachronic linguistics, fit together and where maybe there are issues that need to be resolved. Okay, so my plan for today is this here. So first of all, I'd like to give you a very, very brief tour of diachronic construction grammar. And then I'll come to my 3 open questions, namely, first, what's the object of study in diachronic construction grammar? 2, when is a new construction a new construction? And 3, what knowledge is represented by the nodes in the constructional network, and what knowledge is represented by the connections between them? All right, so let's start. What's a constructional approach to language change? I see it as essentially a new perspective on language change that adopts the central idea of construction grammar that knowledge of language is a big network of symbolic units and nothing else in addition. So this means that language change from the view of construction grammar consists of things that happen to this network. So we can think quite naively about changes in this network, saying that, okay, things that can happen include the following. For instance, new nodes, new constructions may appear in that network. Or things may happen to existing constructions. They may change in form and meaning, become more frequent, less frequent, things like that. Also, since we're talking about a network, there are not only things that can happen to the nodes in that network, but also things that happen to the connections between the nodes. So we might see links in the network emerging or disappearing, or we might see existing links becoming stronger or weaker. I want to say a few words about each of these items here. A lot of attention has been directed at this first idea of new nodes emerging in the network. So Traugott and Trousdale have written a beautiful book about this that lays out the general issues in constructionalization. And they distinguish between 2 types of constructionalization, namely lexical constructionalization on the one hand, so coinage of new lexical material like photobomb, Twitter words, or Brexit. And on the other hand, grammatical constructionalization, the coming into being of grammatical construction. So basically everything that used to be talked about under the heading of grammaticalization. Right, so how constructions come into being is of course a fascinating issue, and there's a reason why this has been discussed in as much detail as it has, but of course there's more going on. So when changes happen to existing constructions in the network, the term constructional change has been often used to capture the processes that can affect existing construction. And the definition you see here is one that I came up with. So I view this process, or this bundle of processes, really as what happens when a construction is selectively singled out. Yeah? So constructional change selectively seizes one conventionalized form-meaning pair of a language and then alters it in terms of either its form, its function, any aspect of its frequency, its distribution in the community of speakers, or indeed any combination of these. Yeah? So that is what can happen to a construction, and to the extent that it happens really just to one single form-meaning pair, we can say that this is constructional change rather than systemic change that affects the language as a whole. All right, just to flesh this out a little bit, this won't surprise you. So changes in form cover everything from phonological changes, like phonological reduction, to, say, the obligatorification of a constituent. Michael Israel's study of the way construction showed how the final prepositional phrase became more and more obligatory over time. Or also the process of host class expansion. So here I have the example of it clefts, which adopted more and more constituent types into its scope. Yeah, so it started out with focus phrases that had to be nominal, and then prepositional phrases, adverbial phrases, and finally also in clauses entered the picture and became available as a host class for it clefts. So all of these are changes in form, changes in function. Also, this won't be shockingly new to you. There's lexical semantic change, everything that happens to lexical items in terms of meaning change. There are all meaning changes that happen to grammaticalizing constructions. So the development from movement verbs into tense markers, or perception verbs into causal markers and other grammatical formants. And of course, it includes also meaning change that goes on in secondary grammaticalization. So when an already grammatical element changes its meaning, either since from a temporal connective to a causal connective, or you can think of deontic modals becoming epistemic modals, and so on and so forth. Right. Changes in frequency include declines or increases in text or type frequencies, changes in the relative frequency of constructional variants. So, for instance, it used to be that S genitives in English with inanimate possessors, like in last week's events, are relatively rare, and today they're much more common. Or we also see changes in the social distribution of a construction. So I have colleagues who completely deny that they're saying, I was like, what's that all about? But of course they do, because this has spread so far as to include virtually everyone. But it advanced in a certain demographic, was picked up by others, and so made its way through the community of speakers. Right, all of these are frequency changes, but typically, of course, we see everything going on at once in constructional change. Form changes, meaning changes, frequency changes, and that is rather typical. Okay, moving on to changes that affect links in the network. Links in the network may emerge or disappear, and one example of links emerging would be the example of meaning extension, where an existing form is linked to a new meaning. So let's say we take hopefully, which acquires new meanings, and so an existing form with a meaning is linked to a new meaning that independently also existed already, but not in this combination. Right. Another example of connectivity change would be what could be called synonym linkage. When you have a newly emerging construction that enters a grammatical paradigm, say, that emerging construction is linked to its competitors in the paradigm, so that there are links between equivalent constructions. So for instance, take the get passive. It's not too far-fetched to assume that speakers make a mental connection between the newly emerging get passive and already existing ways of expressing the idea of a passive. Right. Just to show you another example of connectivity change, existing links can also become stronger or weaker. This is a screenshot from the Koha corpus showing you changes in mutual association strength, namely collocates of gay. So you see on the left-hand side things that used to be gay, and on the right-hand side you see things that are gay now. And you notice that the collocates of gay have changed a lot, which of course reflects meaning change, lexical meaning change. All right, this just as a very, very brief tour of diachronic construction grammar. Changes in the constructional network that include, but are not restricted to, constructionalization, constructional change, connectivity changes, and changes in connection strength. All right, this was really just meant as a very brief primer. Now, what about those open questions? Right, the question I want to start with, seemingly innocent, is this one. What is the object of study in diachronic construction grammar? And at first glance, the answer to this seems to be rather trivial. Yeah. In fact, I had it on the slide. The object of study are constructions and how they change over time, changes in the constructional network. However, constructions and how they change over time can be understood in quite different ways. So, do we talk about constructions as mental representations of language, pieces of linguistic knowledge, generalizations that may change over time from one generation to the other? Or do we talk about constructions as linguistic forms that we can observe in the physical record, that is, in historical corpora? And it's my impression that quite often the difference between the two is not actually addressed, and the primary object of study are really the forms of language, so that diachronic construction grammar has a thing for the physical record without committing really to the mind. And there's a reason for this. Dirk Noël has pointed out that many functionalists and cognitivists who have joined the constructional enterprise through diachronic construction grammar, they have long been working with a pre-theoretical constructional notion. So a notion that works very well as a label for morphosyntactic structures when you want to avoid terminology that comes with its own theoretical baggage. Yeah? So the term construction can be very conveniently used in order to talk about linguistic forms and their meanings, their historical developments, even when considerations such as speakers' mental representations of language are really not at stake and no claim about these representations is being made. Yeah? And you can still reap some benefits of construction grammar, such as describing things like non-compositional meanings or coercion effects. Right, so diachronic construction grammar can be adopted as a descriptive framework that allows the description of changes in form-meaning pairs, and any reference to the psychological reality of these form-meaning pairs can be left implicit. Okay, now I sense that maybe a few people in the audience are a little uncomfortable with the idea that there might be a kind of construction grammar that is completely agnostic with regard to cognition. Yeah. Okay. So an idea that may be on people's minds is, you know, shouldn't diachronic construction grammar just embrace both of the two poles and study how the mind relates to the physical record? And of course, making inferences about linguistic knowledge on knowledge of speakers that have been dead for quite some time, that's less than trivial. But we can nonetheless point to a number of encouraging examples where this has been attempted, and I can't really gloss over the fact that we have people in this room who are addressing this head on. So Peter and his group are here. The Mind-Bending Grammars project does exactly that. I want to give you also another example of a study that does exactly this kind of research. So Christoph Wolk and colleagues have investigated the diachrony of the dative alternation, the choice between the ditransitive construction, I wrote my sister a long letter, and the prepositional dative construction, I wrote a long letter to my sister. And based on present-day corpus data and psycholinguistic experimentation, we actually know a whole lot about how the dative alternation works, in particularly that there are determining factors such as the verb type, the subject, and whether it's pronominal or a noun phrase, then whether or not the recipient is discourse given or discourse new, how long the theme is that is transferred from an agent to a recipient, and also whether the recipient is animate or not. So for instance, a recipient that is discourse given tends to bias speakers towards the transitive, and a short theme would bias people towards the prepositional dative. Yeah, we know in very fine detail how these factors bias people towards one alternative or the other. And what Christoph Wolk and colleagues wanted to find out is whether these factors could also be seen at work in historical corpus data. Because if they were, that would mean that we can actually make some inferences about the competence of earlier generations of speakers. So here's what they say, and I want to read this to you. They say that the likelihood of finding a particular linguistic variant in a particular context in a corpus can be shown to correspond to the intuitions that speakers have about the acceptability of that particular variant, given the same context. They continue, our work ultimately aims to illuminate aspects of the linguistic knowledge that writers in the late modern English period must have had and how this knowledge has evolved over time. Okay, so if we can triangulate psycholinguistic data and present-day corpus data and get a reasonably good grip on that, and if we then take historical corpus data and triangulate between the historical corpus data and the present-day corpus data, that allows us to make some educated inferences about how speakers of past generations would have thought about these alternations and these constructions. All right, so the question now is, do we want something like a cognitive commitment for diachronic construction grammar? Do we want to say that construction grammar has to be about mental issues, and so we don't want studies that just address the physical record? It has to be said that for many phenomena in historical linguistics, any claims about cognition are really hazardous. Yeah? There's too little data, too little that is known about the social context of language use. And so it may be a tall order to want this for all diachronic studies that are out there. Yeah? So even though the data may be patchy in places, we still may want to talk about these phenomena in terms of constructions, that there are maybe non-compositional meanings or funny constraints. Yeah? So I would propose that we don't impose any kind of commitment. We just ask people to be maximally explicit about where they stand. Yeah? Do you want to make a claim about mind-bending grammars, or are you just happy to talk about constructions and their structures in a given corpus? Without the latter kind of research, I would argue that construction grammar would lose some important insights. But I can see that we can talk about this, and there may be different opinions out there. All right, with that, I'd like to come to my second open question, namely, when is a new construction a new construction? And this relates to Traugott and Trousdale's issue of constructionalization. There's another quote that I have to read out to you. So they define constructionalization in the following way, namely as the creation of form-meaning combinations of signs, where form and meaning are both new. Yeah? Constructionalization forms new type nodes which have new syntax or morphology and new coded meaning in the linguistic network of a population of speakers. And an important addendum to this definition is that both form and meaning have to be new. So formal changes alone and meaning changes alone cannot constitute constructionalization. Let's look at this in some detail. So here we have a form-meaning pair, and let's say that the construction develops in such a way that a new meaning becomes associated with that form. Well, that would not be constructionalization. That would be meaning extension and constructional change. Likewise, if you have one form associated with a meaning, developing a second form, let's say in phonological reduction, or maybe host class expansion, yeah, an it cleft first occurring only with nominal focus phrases and then adopting new kinds of focus phrases into its repertoire. Also that is not constructionalization, that is constructional change. Constructionalization would be, we have a new form and a new meaning, and then over time, this new form-meaning pairing gradually emancipates itself from the erstwhile construction that it came from. Yeah? So this is constructionalization. If you look at it this way, it sounds like a really reasonable idea. Yeah? But I want to show you an example that makes me doubt whether it's really the best way of looking at changes in the constructional network. So here's an example, namely the verb confirm. In this particular diagram, confirm is a verb that occurs with a direct object, so a nominal complement, and the meaning is you verify that something is true. So in expressions like confirm my fears or confirm the rumor. And over time, we have corpus evidence that confirm changed its syntactic behavior so that that clauses became much more common with confirm. Yeah, that clauses with confirm are already quite well attested in the 19th century, but they've steadily increased in frequency over the past 200 years. So today, if you're looking for confirm in the corpus, you're much more likely to find something like confirm that the figures are accurate or confirm that you're on time. Now, more recently, a new meaning of confirm has emerged. And this new meaning of confirm is metonymically related to the basic one. It's exemplified in examples such as these here. Michael, question mark, Pensley here, just calling to confirm that you've got the new Bundy ads ready for us today. And you see the meaning change is quite subtle. But confirm doesn't mean verify that something is true. It means ask someone else to verify that something is true. So there's an intersubjective component that has been added to this. And this is not an error or an isolated example. You find actually many examples like this. Before we begin the interview itself, I'd like to confirm that you have read and signed the informed consent form. Yeah, so this is systematic, it happens. So what this means is that we have a new link between the confirm with that clause and a new meaning along the lines of ask someone to verify that something is true. All right, so is this constructionalization? The host class expansion part is not constructionalization. That is just change that happens at the formal pole of the construction. And once you have this, you know, another couple of years go by and something happens at the meaning pole, and this is also not constructionalization. It's just paradoxically that the result of these two changes looks like constructionalization. So we have a new form-meaning pair, even though what brought us here is just a combination of two constructional changes. So when is a new construction a new construction? I'm not saying that we should get rid of the label constructionalization. I think it's a useful label for the emergence of new form-meaning pairs in the constructional network, if that's what you want to describe. But in practice, distinguishing between constructionalization and what we could call conspiring constructional changes, that may well turn out to be impossible. Alternatively, what I would like to propose as an alternative really is that we'll have other distinctions than constructionalization versus constructional change that may actually help us describe what's going on in a constructional network. And here's a table of categories that I think would be up for the job. So let's say that we cross-tabulate change types such as emergence, strengthening, weakening, and disappearance. And on the top, we have the parts of the network to which these changes happen. Yeah? So we have, for instance, the emergence of new forms, like words like selfie or Brexit, which of course emerge not only as forms, but have meanings that are attached to them. So the emergence of new meanings goes along with them. We also have, say, the strengthening of meanings when a concept becomes more popular over time. So people these days are much more likely to talk about gluten intolerance than they were just a couple of years ago. Yeah, it's becoming more and more of a thing. We can talk about the disappearance of connections. In, for instance, the English ditransitive, which is no longer used with certain types of verb, such as forbid. Yeah, it used to be possible to say, I forbid you the bedroom. It no longer is. Okay. So that much about the question when a new construction is a new construction. I'd like to move on to the last question, which is actually not only concerned with diachronic construction grammar, but which has implication for construction grammar writ large. And the question is, what knowledge is represented by the nodes, and what knowledge is represented by the connections between them? And because this is a clunky and cumbersome question, I rephrased it as the fat node problem. So what's the fat node problem? Current models of construction grammar, and this holds, I think, for pretty much all of them. So current implementations of construction grammar store nearly all the information, all the linguistic knowledge in the nodes. Yeah, that's where the fat nodes come from. And only very little information in the connections between the nodes. So in our current models of construction grammar, what are the connections for? They are for two things, mainly. They are symbolic links between form and meaning, and they are categorizing relationships, inheritance links. So the ditransitive is a kind of verb phrase construction, and so on and so forth. And you see these nodes and links in textbooks. So this is a picture from Croft and Cruz 2004, where they draw up a constructional taxonomy. And you see here there are the instance links. What you don't see in this graph are the symbolic links, because what's written in the boxes is actually a shorthand for a form-meaning pairing. So the symbolic links are hidden in the boxes, but the boxes themselves are the fat nodes. Yeah? So each box contains form and meaning and information about the respective constructions. Okay, why is this a problem? What is the fat node problem? And here I got a quote from Dick Hudson, who pointed this out. So he says the following: I believe that language is indeed a network, and that this network is indeed a structure. Many other readers may protest that they too see language as a network. After all, cognitive linguists envisage an elaborate network comprising any number of conventional units linked by categorizing relationships, that's a Lannecker quote, or a network of constructions which captures our grammatical knowledge of language in toto, that is, its constructions all the way down. That's a Goldberg quote. But notice that in these cases, the complex units which the network connects have their own internal structure, which is not part of the network. Now, they're the fat nodes that are really something extra, not a network. Network theory goes further by claiming that it's networks all the way down. All right. And you can kind of see this now, just take a picture of a neural network where the nodes really are slim and stupid. They don't do anything much. Yeah? You can excite them and then they fire, but they don't contain a whole lot of information about semantics and constraints and phonological form and all of this. Okay. So how do we make construction grammar more networky and less nodey? I have some ideas. And to give you a quick example of how I think that this could be, by the way, this needn't be done in an all or nothing manner. All I'm saying is that I think we should think about making construction grammar more networky and less nodey. All right, so to move towards this goal, let me say a few words about the English modal auxiliaries and how they've changed in recent times. So an assumption that I make is that when a speaker knows a modal auxiliary, such as may, for instance, they know not only its general morphosyntactic behavior, namely that it takes an infinitive complement, it can invert with the auxiliary, it can take a negative contraction, all that, but in addition, knowledge of a modal auxiliary includes that the auxiliary tends to co-occur with some elements more frequently than with others. So some of the associative links you see here in this toy network are stronger than others. And I think this is part and parcel of linguistic knowledge. And I think this is something that also Thomas referred to when he talked about construction grammar earlier today. Right, if we take this view, then we can actually look at historical corpora and see how collocations of auxiliaries and their lexical complements changed over time. So, let's say, for instance, that these are results from the BNC, so we're in the 1990s, that indicate that may during this time co-occurred a lot with verbs such as be, do, say, and so on and so forth. And let's say that we recognize that over time there are certain changes happening to this network and to the respective connections and their strengths. Okay, so this is something that I wanted to explore systematically, not for just one modal, but in fact for the 9 core modals of English. I used the corpus of historical American English for this and retrieved data for the 9 core modals followed by a verb in the infinitive. And the scope of this study here is from the 1860s to the 2000s. So I retrieved collocate frequencies of the 9 modals. And this is a snippet of the data that you see here. In the columns, you see the 9 modals, and in the lines, there are the frequencies of the lexical verbs that collocate with them. And you see that highly frequent verbs such as be, do, and have are frequent with virtually all the modals, but already here you can see some interesting asymmetries, for instance, with can and could. Can have is not all that frequent when you compare it to could have. And there are other asymmetries that I could point to. Now, what I wanted to do with this data is that I wanted to compare similarities of these modals. So reasoning that if 2 modals occur with similar sets of collocates at similar frequencies, they would stand in a close semantic relation. So they form, they have a lot of connection in the network. This is essentially Firth's idea that you shall know a word by the company it keeps. And if you do this for all pairs of modals, you can contrast them in terms of their collocates and see which one patterns in similar ways. For instance, we could look at could and may and add up the frequency differences between all the different collocates and get to some sort of numerical estimate of how similar or different they are. Or we could look at must and should, do the same thing, and actually see whether they are more different from one another than could and may, or more similar to one another. And as it turns out, should and must, correlate rather nicely with regard to their collocate frequency, suggesting that there is some semantic relation, whereas could and may have a more unruly cloud of collocates, suggesting that they serve different functions. Okay, so if we come up with pairwise comparisons like this for all 9 modals, we can quantitatively assess the mutual similarities and use a method such as multidimensional scaling to represent those differences in a graph such as the following. So here you see the 9 modals arranged on a 2-dimensional map that reflects collocational behavior, and this graph here is based on data from the 1860s. Each modal construction is a bubble, and bubbles that are close to one another occur with similar sets of lexical verbs at similar frequencies. So you see that, for instance, must and should are relatively close, whereas could and may are relatively far apart. In this graph, bubble size represents text frequency. So would is the most frequent modal. You see that up there in the corner. And shall, in the middle there, is the least frequent one. Okay, so assuming for the moment that relative closeness in this visualization means semantic similarity, what can we actually see? We can see that, for instance, must, should, and shall pattern closely together, suggesting that, well, these are modals that encode obligations and have something in common in that way. We see that might and could pattern together. They encode possibilities. And we see that would has a profile very much of its own. So it seems to be doing something different from the rest of the modals. I would now like to show you how these modals developed over the past 150 years to see whether there are actually developments in the mutual similarities of the modals. Okay, here we see them. And I would like you to focus on the modal may down there and what happened to it. So the years start moving, and you see that there are developments in the entire modal system. The modal system is on the move, but may shows a particularly systematic development, moving into the territory of should, must, and might. And this has been described elsewhere as may acquiring more and more epistemic meanings. So looking at this graph, I was wondering whether that was actually the case. So I decided to analyze may a little more closely using one of the constructional methods that Thomas has already talked about. So the general logic of using what's called a distinctive colloquy analysis is to look at the collocates of a particular construction, comparing those frequencies that you find there to a second construction, and to see whether some lexical elements are overrepresented or underrepresented in a given construction. So here in this toy example, you see that Y is similarly distributed across the two, but with regard to X and Z, we have an asymmetry. So Z is much more associated with construction A, and X is much more associated with construction B. This can be exploited for diachronic purposes, so we can also analyze the same construction across two different periods of time, meaning that this construction has changed in its collocational behavior from being very much associated with Z to being very much associated with X and not so much with Z. So I did this for may in the 1860s against may and its collocates in the 2000s. And what you see in this table are the verbs whose distribution is maximally uneven across the two time periods. So for instance, may say occurs 277 times in the 1860s. That's a lot more than we would expect by chance. And conversely, an expression like may help is much more typical of the 2000s. Yeah? So here the observed frequency is much higher than the expected frequency. Of course, in order to be able to say anything meaningful about these contrasts, we have to take a look at actual examples with these verbs. And if we look at examples with the verbs that are associated with the respective periods, it turns out that examples with say, do, add, and judge, which are characteristic of the 1860s period, what we see is that permissive meanings of may predominate. Yeah? If I may say so, you may do that, and so on and so forth. Conversely, we're looking at examples of the 2000s where verbs such as have, help, want, need, and sound tend to be overrepresented. Then we get meanings that are more epistemic. So I may have told you, or the police may want to speak with you, or you may need to cook them in 2 batches and things like that. All right, so what this tells us is that may has seen connectivity changes that reflect meaning changes that have been going on, so that the network of the English modal auxiliaries has been reconfiguring itself and has changed in the way connections are strengthened or weakened. I'd like to come to an end. So here again are the three open questions. What's the object of study in diachronic construction grammar? When is a new construction a new construction? And what knowledge is represented by the nodes and the connections between them? And I hope that it somehow came through that on some level these questions are actually related because they all point to the importance of connectivity changes, changes of connectivity in the constructional network. So new links emerging or new meanings being linked to an existing form. Or when constructionalization produces new nodes, how are these linked to existing nodes that are similar in meaning or form? I also think that changes in connection strength are a topic that needs much more investigation. So how do associative links between two constructions become stronger or weaker? Or how do construction internal links between form and meaning become stronger or weaker? So interesting work of this kind is actually being done as we speak. And our host, Thiago, actually has been working on this. And I do recommend that you look at his ideas. For instance, there's one hypothesis that he calls the constructional convergence hypothesis that relates to connections between unrelated constructions that may emerge and create new blended constructions. This actually relates to the concept of constructional contamination. There was a talk earlier today on that. So this is an idea to look out for. Another one is what Thiago calls the construction network reconfiguration hypothesis. So what is the result of constructionalization in terms of connections around the newly emerging constructions? Okay, with this kind of idea, I'd like to let you go. Thank you for your attention, and thank you.
Hello, okay. I just must state that I didn't ask Martin to do that. But thank you. So, questions?
I know the name of this gathering is the International Construction Grammar Conference. Nevertheless, I wonder what you would say were someone to claim that it's actually frames all the way down.
I have no trouble with that.
Hi, I just, the business with it being networks all the way down, I'm still trying to figure out how that's actually substantively different as long as we actually know what these nodes are. I mean, I'm just not sure that the best description of what's inside these nodes is as a network necessarily. And I hesitate to jump to that conclusion. I think it's tempting to think there's another reductio after the ones that we've already done, but I think it's actually complicated. And I mean, I'm sure that the people who say it's networks all the way down would say it's complicated too, but I mean, I think it's actually complicated in a way that can't be reduced like that. I mean, that's just a statement, but do you have a reaction to that?
I agree. And my response would be just to ask, well, maybe we should acknowledge that for us, it's not networks all the way down, but we do want to keep this descriptive level of the construction in which we locate features and meanings and constraints. And but if we do that, then it's a matter of intellectual honesty to then say, well, our approach is not as reductive as it could possibly be. Yeah? So we leave this job to someone else in that case, which I'd be fine with. Yeah? But I think it needs to be just acknowledged.
This isn't a question about the core of your paper. I think you contrasted changes that pertain to individual constructions and systemic change. Yeah. What would be systemic change from the point of view of construction grammar? Isn't that also an open question for diachronic construction grammar?
Maybe so. So when I talk about systemic changes, I'm thinking about, for instance, phonological sound change. Yeah. So there you might say, well, we have lexical diffusion, so maybe it operates construction by construction. But there are certain sound changes that seem to diffuse very much independently of any constructional organization. So you don't get a sound change in a vowel or a consonant only in relative clauses. Yeah, so that doesn't happen. That's silly. Another example of a systemic language change would be maybe massive deflection as a result of language contact. So also there you could say, well, it affects this construction and that construction and that construction. But really, it's a global phenomenon. It affects the entire language, and maybe there are certain constructions that are more vulnerable than others. Some are more robust, but nonetheless, the phenomenon is one that should not be tied to any single construction or any single group of constructions. So I think it's important to keep in mind that this happens, yeah, that there are global systemic phenomena for which construction grammar maybe isn't the best framework.
The first question you asked was, what's the object of diachronic construction grammar? And by the end of your talk, it seemed pretty clear that the object is cognitive, but that you still sort of thought that there was some tension there between the physical record and the idea that the physical record represents the minds of people at some point in history. But I think I would like to propose, at least, that everything that we're talking about when we talk about the historical record is a mental object. That somebody who compiles a dictionary of Old English, for example, is making statements about the minds of speakers of Old English, right? That if we believe that the lexicon and grammar really exist on a continuum, then we need to hold ourselves accountable to that theory and acknowledge that everything that we're saying is a statement about people's minds, even if we're accessing those minds through things that those people wrote down hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, I lean towards that position. I guess that's what you picked up. I don't think everybody does, and I don't think we should impose this leaning onto other people. Thomas told us, linguists say they mustn't impose.
Well, I don't take that position because I think what corpora always record is variation, even though you may actually find that a group of speakers has no variation but variant A, another group has variant B, and then you find like 70% variant A and 30% variant B in the corpus. So what you find in the corpus is not necessarily what people have in their mind. You may just have different people in the corpus.
I think we definitely have to acknowledge that we can't know with as much precision about speakers who are more distantly removed from ourselves. But I think we can still know some things, right? So even the things that you said are statements about the mental representations of certain individuals in certain populations. They're not very precise statements, but I think that's fine.
I think it's also healthy to remember that not all of linguistics is about the mind. Yeah? Maybe people in this room have the view, and I share that view, that really what I want to do as a linguist is to find out more about linguistic knowledge. But then again, there are many branches of linguistics that are not primarily concerned with this. We want to find out about different varieties of a language. We want to describe different languages as they are spoken across the globe. And who are we to impose on the people who are doing this important work to say, well, you really ought to be studying the cognitive stuff? Yeah. So I guess, no, Michael, help me.
I think you correctly anticipate that that I want to defend a little bit the position that it's not all about the mind. I want to defend it on a very practical grounds, which I think you do as well. That for some types of things, it's true that of course all of these things do reflect the mind, you know, and that's what makes it interesting, right? I mean, why do you study historical language? You want to know something about what those people were doing back then, and you know, ultimately, like how English and German are connected, and you know, all these things. You know, it is the human connection that makes it of interest. But if you really worried about exactly what was going on in the mind every time you look at different diachronic differences, there's a whole bunch of work you would never do, because, I mean, and that work, you know, the initial work that would take a ton of time and, you know, collating differences across things, you might not be able to draw any conclusions about what was going on in the mind. But it's still important because you can see that there was a difference, and maybe somewhere down the line, people who are more cognitively inclined and have more resources or more theories or whatever will be able to draw a conclusion about the mind from that. But I think there's a real danger in insisting that it's all about the mind, that it'll cut off a pathway to this more descriptive work. And I think that's true for corpus linguistic work as well, that we can study corpus differences, and we don't have to know everything about what that means to know that there is something there. And that's useful by itself. It doesn't do everything, but it does do something, and it's premature to just say it must always be about the mind, and we must keep that front and center at all times.
Okay. All right. Peter?
Yeah, I very much agree with this comment, and I was just wondering, you had this open question, shouldn't we be more explicit about what our position is? But I wonder, perhaps there is just many people that don't want to be explicit about it and want to remain agnostic.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay, I said we shouldn't impose on other people, but I think this asking for an explicit commitment or disavowal, that's something that could be done. Yeah, and I agree that it's very comfortable not having to commit, but maybe we should.
Well, some people should, but I mean, there is much research going on where it's probably not really crucial to commit, or...
Yeah, probably so.
Yeah.
Okay. So this will be the last, all right? So.
If you don't mind, I would like to add one more question. Whether this diachronic construction grammar might regard as a priority grammatical constructions. Cognitive grammar and construction grammar are oriented to usage-based structuring, and grammatical construction could be more interesting and surprisingly interesting, I'd say, and might serve as fossils. I came across one interesting example. While future was being shaped in my language, Albanian, it was a particularly historical moment. It was a post-Roman period, and there were two options competing: the Latin version and the Balkan version. But just because it is very likely that it was a post-Roman moment, the Latin version happened to be a bit weaker, and what happened, the Balkan version was established. The Latin being weaker, while it was competing, actually was stronger in another dialect, and it is still stronger in a peripheral dialect. So this was one example, whereas the establishment of perfect is in a much earlier period, and it could be a fossil of different historical conditions. So from this point of view, comparing languages could reveal interesting insight.
I think we need to discuss that between the two of us.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
So before I let you go or set you free, I will require you to provide us with two other instances of the applause construction. So the first one is for the great people that did that in terms of getting things organized. So I would say their names and ask them to stand up so they can be correctly applauded. So Sandra and Eli and other voluntaries that are there. So please stand up, people. Natalia and... and then the last one, I would like to ask for another instance for you for coming. Actually, we don't make this conference, we just make the rules. You make the conference. So we are truly happy and honored and glad that some of you literally crossed half the globe to be here. And after crossing half the globe to be in Rio, not here, you took a bus. And came to Juiz de Fora, and it meant a lot, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in the city. And if you need instructions to do so, the volunteers can help you. As yesterday, they have all good options of bars and places to get unlimited amount of beer and this kind of thing. Okay, so thank you all.